And now we're on Daf Mem Testament Beis. Lahavi chelev sha'al gabe hadakin divrei Rabbi Shmuel. Oh, so now let's keep in mind that there's something, again, we need the whiteboard for this. There's something called a dakin, and then there's something called a keva. And Rabbi Shmuel is saying that when the Torah with the letter Vav is being marbeh, it's not being marbeh the chelev on top of the keva, because that chelev is mutter, but rather the keva that's on top of the dakin, which again, if we had the whiteboard, that's called the duodenum, which I looked in the picture. I don't know. I don't find it right now. I've got to write a letter to the editor here. Anyway, so it turns out that Rabbi Akiva does a great justice and a favor for the Kohen because he's matir the fat on the keva, and the keva was given to the Kohen. Rabbi Akiva, on the other hand, says lahavi chelev shel gabi keva. No, no, no. The vav is telling me that even the chelev, which is on top of the keva, is also awesome. And this whole thing has something to do with the different types of fats, which maybe we'll get into. But certainly, Rabbi Akiva, by asering the fat on top of the keva, and the keva was given to the Kohanim, is not doing a good favor to the Kohanim. Uraminu. And now the Gemara is going to tell us that we have a brisa that goes just the opposite. And Rabbi Shmuel in the second brisa, which we're about to learn, is the one who prohibits the chelev al gabi akeva. And the brisa says the following: V'es kol hachelev shel kerev. What's the vav coming to add and prohibit? Which category of chelev is Rabbi Shmuel Omer ma chelev machasas hakerev krum v'niklaf? So we're getting into the various attributes or qualities of the fat, the different kinds of qualities of the fat. One is called krum, and the other is called niklaf. And it seems that Rabbi Shmuel held that the chelev on top of the keva is also fits into these two descriptive qualities called kerev, called krum and niklaf. So what is krum and niklaf? And again, we'd have to spend a lot of time on this if we had the time. One is called krum, that it's covered by a membrane, but in such a way like it covers the membrane, but very softly, so that now it could be niklaf. You could peel away the fat that covers, and it doesn't adhere firmly to the fat. Okay, so before we had something called the dakim, which we said was called in English the duodenum, and it seems that there are two fats that are adjacent to this sheet of fat that share this, and it's called the fat that's on the intestine. It drapes over the duodenum, and then there's the fat on top of the keva, the abo masu. So accordingly, Rabbi Shmuel holds that the fat that is on the keva is forbidden. It shares both features. It's also krum and it's also niklaf. And kolshke, now which more so, the fat on the dukim, on the duodenum, is forbidden because it has these two features and even has another feature, which we'll get to later. However, Rabbi Akiva, kerev tosov krum v'niklaf, has three different qualities or features. It's number one, tosov, number two, krum, and number three, niklaf. And tosov means it drapes Af kol tosov krum v'nikla, if it has all three salient features, then it is usr. And it turns out that the chelev on top of the keva doesn't have that third feature, namely tosov. And therefore it's adarab, it's Rabbi Akiva who's the one who's matir the chelev on top of the keva. Just give me a second here. Rabbi Akiva holds that the sheet of fat that drapes over the keres has a third feature. It's tosov. It drapes over the haunch, we called it, and does not adhere firmly. It drapes, but doesn't adhere. Is the kumt ois that according to Rabbi Akiva, the chelev al gabi akeva is mutter, which is the exact opposite of what we said before in the first price. So Sholach Ravin Mishmei de Rabbi Yochanan, when we see this contradiction, is Kachi Atzah Mishnah the Eipel Kamaisa. We have two choices here. We could switch around Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva in the first brisa, or we could switch around in the second brisa. And according to Ravin, we're going to switch around in the first brisa. Is kumtais that we're going to accept the second brisa, which presents Rabbi Shmuel as the one who prohibits the chelev al gabi akeva because it has two features, right? It's niklaf. What was the first one again? It's krum and niklaf. And Rabbi Akiva is the one who really does a favor for the Kohanim, and he's matir the chelev al gabi hakeva. Frekti Gemara, my chazis the apchis kamaisa epuk parai. Why do you prefer the second brisa over the first brisa? Shani hacha. The second brisa has one up it. Kevan de ktani ma. Right? It says ma chelev machasas hakerev, etc., etc. So apparently, from the fact that this Tana, the second brisa, uses the word ma, it's somehow more convincing. It's more accurate. Ihachi Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Akiva. Why did the Kohanim owe a debt of gratitude to Rabbi Shmuel for being matir when it's really Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel was aser? Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Shalom Mishum Avosov Leslo Svirle. He himself, Rabbi Shmuel, holds, like we saw in the second brisa, that these two krum and what's it called, krum and niklaf qualities are enough to aser it, and therefore the chelev al gabi hakeva is asur. But he quoted Avosov. He had some sort of tradition from his forebears. That's how he translates it here. That it was mut, meaning like Rabbi Akiva. But at the end of the day, the Kohanim really owed a debt of gratitude to Rabbi Akiva. Omar Rav, chelev tar sosem. Okay, now we get into the sugya of sosem with regard to chelev, right? What happens when you have a puncture? And we discussed many times when something pushes against the puncture and clogs it up. So Rav makes the following distinction. He says there are two categories of chelev. One is sosem and the other is not sosem. If it's chelev that we're allowed to eat, that's sosem. But if it's chelev that we're not allowed to eat, then we're not going to apply the principle of sosem. And the Ran is famous for saying that the whole business here of Rav, when he says that Tamei Eno Sosem is all the Rabbanon, that the Rabbanon were concerned that if we're going to allow the halach of stima to apply even to chelev, meaning real chelev, that's also, then they may come to assume that it's kosher. In any event, Rav Sheshes Omer, Echad Zevi, Echad Zeh Sosem, who cares whether or not it's chelev that's mutter, chelev that's osir? If it's sosem and if it seals the puncture, then it's not a treifa. Boy, Reb Zera comes up with a very strange suffix. Chelev chaya mai. What about the chelev of a chaya? let's say a deer, for example, is a classic case of a kosher chaya. Here's Reb Zera's vacillation. Dafka Omar Chelev Tahar Sosem Hainami Tor. I mean, the chelev of a deer is tar. It's mutter. You're allowed to eat it. Oh, Dilma. Now here he lets the cat out of the bag. He says mishum de mahadek v'hai lo mahadek. There's something in the physics of the chelev of a deer that doesn't really adhere tightly. In other words, it doesn't really do the job. Amar Abai, my tiboilecha. So what was your suffix, Rabbi Zera? Nehi deshari ba'achila. So what if it's tahar? Aduki lo mahadek. If lamaisa it doesn't hold up, then the animal's a treifa. It's punctured. But the answer to this argument of Abaye, and to explain Rabbi Zera's suffix, is the Ran that we mentioned before. The whole thing is the Rabbana. So the Rabbana were afraid that he might eat the chelev if you tell him that this chelev that's tomei is so same. But in the case of the chelev of a chaya, it's mutter anyway. So what are you afraid of? Hahu nekev desatma chelev tomei diosek hamidar baba. So now, how do we paskin? So this came in front of Rava, and Rava says, "My nefesh." What are you worried about? Number one, chada to Omer Rav Sheshes. Why not paskin like Rav Sheshes? But if you'll tell me that no, let's paskin like Rav. HaTorah chasal b'monim shel Yisrael. And therefore, we have to paskin like Rav Sheshes. Amalei Rav Papa Rav. Rav Papa says to Rava, Rav the Isura Doraisa. Rav is saying that the chelev of Tomei is not so same, and therefore you're dealing with trade for Doraisa. The At Amid, you can tell me a Torah chasam amonim shel Yisrael? That doesn't make any sense. You can say a Torah chasa al mamonim shel Yisrael. In the case where they took the kalim, the earthenware kalim out of the ohel. When the Kohen came to be Matame B'tunis Nigei Batim, in order the Torah wants to salvage the earthenware. But okay, that's because the Kohen has not yet determined that it's but to say Torah Kosam Yisrael because we want to save a couple of bucks, therefore we're going to be Mater and Isur. And once again, I quote the Ran that the whole business is Rabbanan. Anyway. Right? So there was a guy who sold pots. Anyway, he sold honey in pots. Fine. And now he left it uncovered. And we have a din of Mayim Magulim that we're afraid a snake may have put its venom inside, and we don't allow eating that. Today we don't have. But anyway. What are you afraid of? There's a machlokus whether honey is included in the Isur of Megulim. Chada Disnan, we paskin like the Chachamim, that Shlosha Mashkin Asur Mishum Gilui, Hayayin Hamayim V'cholav, Sharko Mashkin Mutar, meaning honey is not subject to the Isur of Gilui, the Ode, and even if you'll assume that we paskin like Reb Shimon, who holds that all liquids are subject to Mayim Agulim, is HaTorah Chasam Amonim Shel Yisrael. Amalei Reb Nachbar Yitzchak Rava Reb Shimon Sakanta Nefashos. Reb Shimon holds that the Sakonis Nefashos, if you have exposed honey, and At Amr HaTorah Chasam Amonim Shel Yisrael, we're dealing with Sakonis Nefashos here. So the Gemara says, and Reb Shimon, where's this Reb Shimon who says that even honey is subject to the Isur of Mayim Magulim? The sign we learned it in a brisa. Chamisha ein behem mishum gilui. According to the Tanakama, there are 5 liquids. Now, I'm not sure why the brisa has to list 5 liquids when you just told me there are only 3 liquids of Mayim, Yayin, and Chalav, which are subject to the problem of the snakes and the Mayim Agulim. But anyway, maybe the Brisa here is quoting a different Tana, a third Tana, who holds that all mashkim are subject to the Isur of Mayim Lagulim, except for 5. And which of these five? The most important of them are the first and the fourth. But let's go through the five. Tzir is brine. Chometz is vinegar. Shemen is oil. Dvash is honey. And murias. I don't know exactly what murias is. It's some sort of dip that's prepared from fatty fish innards. Whatever it is. So it comes out that shemen, that dvash is not included in the Isur Gilui. But Rav Shimon Omer, af hein yesh behem mishum Gilui. Straight across the board, there's an Isur Gilui. V'yomer Rav Shimon, ani re'isi nocha sheshasa tzir b'tzida. I don't know, the thing is a pellet to me. Rav Shimon was watching snakes in a place called Sidon. Maybe those snakes were Chizbollah snakes. I don't know. Anyway, so Amrulo, so they said to him, you know what? If you saw snakes drinking brine, Shatyavi, those snakes are deranged. The ein mevim raya min hashotim. I guess he's saying like it's an abnormal phenomenon, it's some sort of mutation of nature. In any event, getting back to the story of the pottery dealer with the dvash, Amalei Rav Nachman, Rav says to Rav Nachman, Oduli mias betzir. Even though Reb Shimon holds that everything, all liquids are included in the Isur Gilui, but we don't paskin like Reb Shimon, at least not in the case of tzir. If they discovered some sort of exposed liquid, they didn't automatically asur it. Let's say they had wine or water. What did they do? They poured it into its tzir, and that would neutralize. Now, here's the kal v'chomer. If brine neutralizes venom of a snake, then clearly it itself, brine, is not subject to prohibition against drinking exposed liquids. So even you have to admit that we don't follow Reb Shimon, because look at all these chachamim that would neutralize the contamination of a venom by pouring in brine. So if we don't paskin like Reb Shimon with regard to brine, then maybe we should reject Reb Shimon as far as honey, and then add to boot that Rachmana Chasal Monum Shisho. Amalei Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak responds to Rava, Oduli mias b'dvash. I'm going to tell you that within the context of machlokas about Mayim Begulim, whether it applies to dvash or not, Reb Shimon is not a loner in dvash. Maybe in Seir he was a loner, but not in dvash, because Rabbi Shimon bar Elazar koi kavasa. So we have two Reb Shimons. And Reb Shimon bar Elazar agrees to Reb Shimon. The Sanya v'cheino Reb Shimon bar Elazar Omer, like Reb Shimon, who's probably Reb Shimon bar Yochai, oser b'dvash. Okay, Rabbos, I think this is where we'll stop. It's already time to stop, even though. Should try another few minutes. It's up to you. Yeah, 5 more minutes, so we'll finish the daf. Omer of Nachman, chelev ha'osui kikova eno sosem. So there's a certain type of fat that's shaped like a helmet, and it's called osui kikova, and it doesn't have the power to seal a nekev. Heicha, where is it found, this chelev? Amrile chiti de karshta, v'amrile tarpashta de libo. So some say that it's the chelev, the helmet-shaped chelev that's on the nodules of the fat on the rectum, and others say it's the fat on the pericardium. Okay, so that for that we need a very intricate study of anatomy. Anyway, Omar Rav, Shamini minemi Rav Nachman Tarti. There are two underlying premises here that I heard from Rav Nachman. Number one is chimtza, And we'll soon see that chimtza is a real problem because it cannot effectively seal a puncture. And then there's bar chimtza, which has a more of a power that it's able to be sosin. Chad sosin lo yadana heid minayu, and Rav Huna bar chimtza sosin. Chimtza lo sosin. You want to remember which holds by what? Sounds like chimtza bar chimtza. Anyway, is yafa koach haben mikoach ha'af. We have a principle, which is a Gemara in Shvuos, which has to do with the fact that when the father has a tviyah of mammon, then the father has to take a shvuah. But if he dies and his Yorshim inherit his father, they don't have to take a shvuah in order to collect. So that's called yafa koach haben mikoach ha'av. So bar chimtza is more powerful as a fat to seal up a puncture than chimtza itself. And which is chimtza and which is bar chimtza, and for that we need some more biology. Toshma, the Omer of Nachman. It's unbelievable how often Rav Nachman shows up. Rav and Rav Nachman, they have 90% of this parak is Rav and Rav Nachman. I'm exaggerating, but Inu Mechal Ochli. Okay. Who's Inu? Apparently the tradition in Eretz Yisrael was to classify the fat on the keva as mutter, that you're allowed to eat that fat. But l'didan, but here in Bavel we're machmir, and we don't eat any of the fats. Mistam nami lo sos. However, we're not going to go that far. What do I mean? If in Eretz Yisrael they go as far as to eat bar chimtza, then even though we in Bavel don't eat bar chimtza, but at least grant me a halfway measure, that it's so same. Granted that we, the residents of Bavel, do not actually eat that fat, but surely if the people of Eretz Yisrael eat it, which means it's considered tahar, we must consider it permissible fat, at least with regard to sealing a puncture. Anyway, we see that bar chimtza, the fat that seals punctures, refers to the fat that is subject to the dispute between the minhag of Eretz Yisrael lekula and the minhag of Bavel lechumra. And that minhag and chilukim minhagim between Eretz Yisrael and Bavel is going to be the subject in Mir Hashem of the sugya here on Daf Nun, which we'll learn tomorrow at noontime, correct? Nun at noon. Okay, I wish you a great day.